Hi, I'm Robyn Weigman, and I have the pleasure of introducing the final keynote for this, the 12th Feminist Theory Workshop, Jennifer Nash. Like many of you in this room, I learned the name Jennifer Nash in 2008 when I read an essay she published on intersectionality while she was still a graduate student in African American Studies at Harvard University. What was not yet apparent then, but is absolutely clear now, is that Jennifer Nash is feminist theory's foremost reader of the institutional life of intersectionality, which is the title of her talk today. Her forthcoming book, Black Feminism Reimagined, which I'm happy to say is in the Next Wave series at Duke University Press, offers the most wide-ranging and critically important analysis ever, I think, of intersectionality. In what follows in my introduction, I want to offer a sketch of Professor Nash's critical archive on intersectionality as it converges in Black Feminism Reimagined and place its compelling and at times counterintuitive instincts in relation to her field-forming inquiries into the politics of Black women's pleasure that mark her award-winning first book, The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography. In both books, Professor Nash mobilizes Black feminists' desire as an agent in and of her own thought, deploying Black feminism and seeking to remake its institutional objects and effective attachments as well. In her first foray into an analysis of intersectionality, the 2008 essay, Rethinking Intersectionality, Professor Nash used her training as a lawyer, yes, she has a law degree as well, to map what she called the political, theoretical, and methodological murkiness of intersectionality in order to offer in its closing section a clarion call for intersectionality's analytic future. It is time, she wrote, for intersectionality to begin to sort out the paradoxes on which its theory rests in the service of strengthening its explanatory power, unquote. Over the course of what is now a decade, Professor Nash would extend, revise, and analyze this call, turning her attention in a series of 5 additional essays from what intersectionality might do toward what scholars seek from it, especially as the term has increasingly figured as central to women's studies' own self-defined institutional value. In the essay we read for this workshop on institutionalizing the margins, published in 2014, Professor Nash shifts the analytic optic of intersectionality's time, or of temporality, parsing the ways in which its symbolic capital has traveled past Kimberly Crenshaw's juridical concern for Black women's precarity in a system of law that has only been able to follow one and only one path of subordination and discrimination at a time. By demonstrating how intersectionality operates as a discourse of the field's institutional time, Professor Nash excavates the scenes in which Black women go missing in scholarly conversations that either cast intersectionality's completion as feminism's institutional future or relegate its failures to the seemingly outmoded identity orientations of the past. Through these seemingly oppositional temporalities, Professor Nash underscores intersectionality's role in displacing Black women through the very political and theoretical framework inaugurated to parse their occlusions. In her most recent essay on intersectionality, published in Feminist Theory in 2016, Professor Nash builds on the 2014 essay by once again shifting her critical gaze, taking up scholarly discourses that seek a return to Crenshaw's work to reclaim intersectionality's foundational ground. Analyzing a series of conferences, special issues, and volumes aimed at commemorating intersectionality's 20th anniversary in 2009, Professor Nash offers the concept of intersectional originalism to diagnose an emergent pattern of reading, one that insists on fidelity to Crenshaw's texts as the means to reject critiques of intersectionality and reposition the past as the agency for safeguarding both the field's and feminism's future. In dissecting this reading practice, Professor Nash offers an urgent counter to it by insisting that intersectionality is never singular. It has divergent political, theoretical, and methodological lives, and any attempt to pretend otherwise, she says, to seek a pure or true intersectionality is to engage in a political fantasy that should be deconstructed. Instead of defending intersectionality, she argues, we must unsettle the impulse to protect or rescue feminist analytics, which requires remaining open both to the fact that analytics transform, move, wane, develop, and morph, and to the fact that the way analytics move are political and institutional questions, unquote. As I hope is apparent in this brief summary, Professor Nash's analysis of intersectionality has developed by parsing the complexity of its discursive proliferation in ways that double back on what remained assumed or under-articulated in her earlier discussions. Each of the published essays, and I only talked about 3, but there are 5 or 6, there's also a conversation that she has with another colleague. Each of the published essays turns the frame in a slightly different direction, demonstrating a restlessness with what was at one time at the forefront of her concerns. This restlessness is what makes the forthcoming book, and it's now in press, Black Feminism Reimagined, so compelling. As here, Professor Nash collects the frames she uses in the published essays and extends them by considering the effective life of intersectionality and what it means and how it feels for Black feminist scholars to forge, whether through politics or the field's own disciplinary insistence, their primary attachments to intersectionality. In the end, Professor Nash, quote, seeks to encourage and imagine other ways of feeling Black feminist, other ways of being Black feminist and doing Black feminist labor in the academy. In turning away from what she defines as defensiveness and the toxicity it generates, she marshals, in the name of imagining something new, a reparative syntax by focusing on what she calls Black feminist love and what love can do. The turn to love, like the turn to pleasure in her first book and in the essays that go along with it on sexuality, will no doubt take some readers by surprise, given the conditions of emergency under which Black and brown lives now live. But it is also possible to hear her insistence on imagining the effective contours of Black feminist endurance as precisely a politics born and honed in the face of an anti-Black world. My admiration for Jennifer Nash's ability to question intellectual and institutional formations without refusing her own institutional investments and the pleasures she derives, and we might say demands from them, is quite simply endless. When you read her work, you hear her think, and to hear her think is always to learn. I'm very happy to introduce Jennifer Nash.
How's the sound? Is it okay? Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to start with a few thanks. I want to thank everyone at Duke who made this event possible and who facilitated me being here. It's such a tremendous honor. I spent most of my intellectual coming of age watching live streams of this on YouTube, so it's pretty amazing to actually be here. I especially want to thank Robyn. I feel like we've been engaged in a very long conversation that for me has been incredibly generative. You have also always reminded me that generosity and hospitality can be part of academic life, which I think we can easily forget. And I want to thank And Denise and Sylvia, it's been a pleasure to think alongside you today and yesterday. So my talk for today unfolds in two parts. I want to spend some time mapping the itinerary of my forthcoming book, Black Feminism Reimagined, to help set the stage for the remarks that will follow. And then I will turn toward a sustained engagement with what I term the intersectionality wars in the portion of the talk, which of course I have retitled since the printing of the book, Love Letter to a Critic, or Notes on the Intersectionality Wars. So in an article published in The New Yorker in 2016, Nathan Heller described intersectionality as the heart of contemporary student activism. He writes, and I quote, "If the new campus activism has a central paradigm, it is intersectionality, a theory originating in Black feminism that sees identity-based oppression operating in cross-hatching ways." A year later, Andrew Sullivan published a polemic against intersectionality in New York Magazine. He described intersectionality as, in his words, the latest academic craze sweeping the American academy, and likened it to a religion, which he said produces a dangerous orthodoxy through which all of human experience is explained and through which all speech must be filtered. So both articles were largely and correctly condemned for representing students as hypersensitive and preoccupied with performances of correct left political subjectivity, and for trafficking in deep misunderstandings of intersectionality's histories, critical and political aspirations, and roots in Black feminist theory. Yet what interests me about the articles and the vociferous responses to them by scholars and activists on the US left is how intersectionality acted as the window through which to view the imagined problems or the imagined progress of the contemporary university. In some ways, it's unsurprising that a term rooted in Black women's intellectual production would be figured as a dangerous space of political excess, as an ideology that has colonized the hearts and minds of the vulnerable college student, as this is precisely how Black women's corporeal presences have been endlessly figured. Yet what is new and even surprising is the contention that intersectionality is at the center of the university's intellectual and institutional life. That an understanding of the contemporary university, its politics, its investments, its students, and their activist practices requires contending with intersectionality. So my book, Black Feminism Reimagined, was born from a deep curiosity about the variety of political and theoretical work that intersectionality is called upon to perform in the US Academy, and in the peculiarly contentious battles that have been waged around intersectionality, battles which I argue implicate the body that haunts the analytic Black woman, even if she is not always explicitly named as such. If intersectionality is a term that functions as a barometer measuring and calibrating the political atmosphere of the US university, I argue that it has been most emphatically called upon to do corrective ecological work in the context of women's studies, and that it is in relationship to academic feminism that intersectionality's institutional life has taken shape. Indeed, in Black Feminism Reimagined, I treat intersectionality as women's studies' primary program building initiative, as its institutional and ethical orientation, even as the field retains an ambivalent relationship with the analytic, always imagining it as simultaneously promising and dangerous, the field's utopian future and its past tense. Thus, the book largely focuses on the complicated and contentious relationship between intersectionality and women's studies, arguing that studying the field's engagement with intersectionality allows a window into the discipline's longer and fraught relationship with Black feminist studies, with Black feminists, and even with Black women. Black Feminism Reimagined explores in particular what it has meant for Black feminism and for Black feminists to have intersectionality come to occupy the center of women's studies and to migrate across disciplinary boundaries. That's true. To become a prevailing institutional logic that is both filled with promise and emptied of specific meaning. I ask how Black feminists have made visible their collective feelings about intersectionality's citational ubiquity, to use Robyn's term, in and beyond women's studies, and track the Black feminist affects that attend to the variety of hopes and perils that have been imaginatively tethered to the analytic. Black Feminism Reimagined argues that there is a single affect that has overwhelmingly come to mark contemporary academic Black feminist practice: defensiveness. So let me illustrate defensiveness in two ways. First, through a story, and then through a more detailed explication. And you'll see in the context of this talk, I really enjoy stories about the kind of spectacle of academic life. So, a story. So, I am part of a panel at a small conference with a few other Black feminist scholars, all of whom work on intersectionality. The mood is tense as we discuss the racial politics of intersectionality circulation, its movement across the humanities and social sciences, and its status as women's studies signature analytic. One scholar remarks that intersectionality's ubiquity reminds her of a passage from Ntozake Shange's choreo poem for color girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. Many of you have probably read this. And that phrase that she invoked was, "Somebody almost walked off with all of my stuff." The audience roars in delight. And I find myself fascinated both by the deployment of Shange's provocative image of theft and by the audience's enthusiasm. This book was born of questions that emerged that day. Why had the idea of intersectionality as something stolen resonated so deeply? How might we understand the racial politics of this scene, one where a canonical Black feminist work is used to theorize the violent theft of another canonical Black feminist work? Who owns intersectionality and who steals it? What might this encounter, the use of Shange, and the audience's reaction to it reveal about the affects of contemporary academic US Black feminisms? And what does it mean when an anti-captivity project like Black feminist theory claims ownership as a primary model for conducting Black feminist inquiry? So I treat this scene as a point of departure to capture a practice of Black feminist defensiveness that is manifested most explicitly through Black feminisms and Black feminists' proprietary attachments to intersectionality. Proprietary relationships are marked by desires. And here, I want to think about those desires as a desire to hold on to intersectionality, to keep it close, to guard it. Put differently, defensiveness is largely articulated by imagining intersectionality as terrain, which has been gentrified, a term I will come back to, I promise, colonized and appropriated, and as property which must be guarded, protected, and even reclaimed through the requisite Black feminist vigilance, care, and stewardship. And stewardship is a term that Audrey Hancock has begun to develop in her work. So these attachments can script Black feminism into a largely protective posture, leaving us mired in policing intersectionality's usages, demanding that intersectionality stay located within Black feminism, and reasserting intersectionality's true origins in Black feminist texts, though up for grabs among Black feminists are which texts are the sort of true origins of intersectionality, but I'll talk more about that. It is impossible to name Black feminist defensiveness without a rigorous consideration of the place of Black feminist theory generally and intersectionality specifically in women's studies. So the book situates Black feminist defensiveness in the context of US women's studies, an interdiscipline that is organized around the symbol of Black woman, even as the field retains, I would argue, little interest in the materiality of Black women's bodies, the complexities of Black women's experiences, or the heterogeneity of Black women's intellectual and creative production. Black feminist defensiveness emerges precisely because the symbol of Black woman is incessantly called upon to perform intellectual, political, and affective service work for women's studies, much as Black female faculty are called upon to perform diversity service work in women's studies and across the university. This particular form of feminist diversity service work is evident in the general sentiment that women's studies can be remedied or already has been remedied through the incorporation of Black feminist theory into the field's canon, and through centering intersectional theories and methods, through the hailing of Black feminist theory as the remedy to feminism's ills, or through the ways that Black female faculty are called upon to literally embody and perform the field's transformation. So as we consider intersectionality as feminist diversity work, we can think of how myriad women's studies departments and programs celebrate their intersectional coursework, their intersectional approach to theories, methods, and approaches, how intersectionality as a free-floating word permeates job advertisements in our field as a way of signaling both a desire for Black women and a desire for complex feminist scholarship. We can also consider the prevailing sense that simply invoking intersectionality saves women's studies from its imagined downfall, white feminism. And indeed, I'm interested in how these terms are so often invoked as foils, right? So if intersectionality is the promise of feminism, white feminism is its ugly underside, right? So in a moment when intersectionality is taken up endlessly as the cure to what ails academic, and I should say popular feminism as well, where intersectionality stands for ethical and correct feminist theory and politics, Black feminist defensiveness develops as a kind of critical response to the analytics troubling institutional life, to the terms used in department mission statements, in university strategic plans. And at my last university, it appeared in the strategic plan. And as the New Yorker suggests, by university students, faculty, and administrators deploying intersectionality to show off their left bona fides. So in treating defensiveness as a defining contemporary Black feminist affect, my intention is not to diagnose individual Black feminists as defensive or to pathologize Black feminist feelings. Nor is my impulse to ignore histories of anti-Blackness and misogyny, including the invisible labor of Black women inside the academy, which quite literally kills Black female academics. This all renders Black feminist defensiveness a political response to ongoing academic violence. I seek to ethically attend to that history, even as I critique the proprietary impulses of Black feminism, in an effort to reveal how the defensive affect traps Black feminism, hindering the tradition's world-making capacities. My critique is born from seeing defensiveness as a practice of a certain kind of imagined agency that is seemingly exercised on behalf of Black women's intellectual production and on behalf of Black women as subjects worthy of study. It is, though, ultimately a dangerous form of agency, one that traps Black feminism and Black feminists by locking us into what I call the intersectionality wars, and I will say more about that, rather than liberating us from those battles and enabling us to reveal how deeply problematic those battles are. Ultimately, the defensive posture produces a kind of impasse for Black feminist theory, one that keeps us fundamentally stalled and that frustrates our visionary project. So in naming defensiveness's hold on Black feminist theory and theorists, my impulse is to offer an invitation for Black feminists to imagine, perform, and practice our attachments to analytics that move beyond a territorial hold. My goal then is to reimagine Black feminism as it is practiced and, more importantly, felt in the US Academy. So that's a sort of stage for the project. So the more substantive portion of the talk, I call Notes on a Critic, or I call Notes on the Intersectionality Wars, or Love Letter to a Critic. So that's where I'm headed now. So I discovered something about myself when reading a recently published edited volume. I am a vocal critic of intersectionality. That's a quote. To be hailed as one of intersectionality's critics is to inhabit deeply uncomfortable terrain. Jasbir Puar notes, and here I'm quoting her, the claim to intersectionality as the dominant feminist method can be produced with such insistence that an interest in exploring other frames gets rendered as problematic and even produces women of color feminists invested in other genealogies as race traders. Puar reveals that scholars who pose questions about intersectionality's critical limits or who even explore other analytics are often marked as traitorous. To have one's work deemed traitorous is to feel as though one has been removed, excommunicated even, from the boundaries of Black feminism, precisely because one is imagined as inflicting harm on the very intellectual, political, ethical, and creative terrain that Black women have labored to carve out. My impulse then was to understand vocal critic as much more than an intellectual critique. This was an allegation, challenging my political commitments to the project of Black feminism. My desire, of course, was to seek to defend myself from these charges, to insist that I admire intersectionality, that my work aspires to be generative, not destructive. This talk aspires to suspend that critical desire of mine, even as I am deeply intrigued by it. Rather than resist the term critic or refuse its interpolation, this talk follows the word critic around the Black feminist theoretical archive, endeavoring to carefully trace to whom it attaches and what makes that attachment possible. I pose questions like, what are the intellectual and political conditions that made me understand the word critic as an allegation? Why has the term critic, in the context of robust scholarly debate about intersectionality, taken on such a powerful charge? My investment in tracking the meanings embedded in the term critic follows Claire Hemmings' call to consider the stories we tell. And so, following her lead, I assert that Black feminist theorists emphatically retell a singular story about intersectionality. The analytic is the subject of vicious and inaccurate attacks, the victim of an intense backlash, and Vivian May has developed the idea of backlash in her newer work, marked by what May describes as a remarkable degree of epistemic intolerance. In this account, there are a group of scholars who support intersectionality, presumably Black feminists, and a powerful chorus of scholars who are opposed to the analytic, the critics. This is a deeply compelling narrative. It has a victim, intersectionality, or perhaps more broadly, Black feminism and Black feminists, and perhaps by implication, all Black women. And it is a story that has a villain, the ubiquitous critic. The story also has a moral imperative. Black feminists must save intersectionality from attack. This affectively saturated narrative has come to animate the intersectionality wars, the contentious battles that swirl around intersectionality and which garner their urgency and ethical legitimacy from attempts to protect intersectionality from the loveless and world-ending figure of the critic. And I borrow the term loveless and world-ending from Sarah Cervinek. Yet, as I argue in this talk, this compelling narrative is the site of various projections and fantasies. A close engagement with Black feminist citational practices reveals that intersectionality's ubiquitous critic is actually imaginatively produced by Black feminists as we are locked into practices of holding intersectionality captive. In treating the critic as an imaginative projection, I am careful not to argue that Black feminists are engaged in dreaming up something that is not there. Instead, I consider how women's studies positioning of Black feminists as disciplinarians who demand that the field offer an account of Black women actually gets performed by Black feminists as they contend with intersectionality's movement to the field's center by guarding intersectionality from the phantasm of the critic and by arguing that the critic fails to offer the necessary account of Black women. In other words, Black feminists are enlisted in becoming precisely what the field imagines us to be, relentless, demanding, policing disciplinarians, as they expose and condemn the critics who are imagined to fail to adequately and fairly account for intersectionality, for Black feminist theory, and for Black women's intellectual production. So ultimately, this talk shows what happens when Black feminists, who've long been a part of a movement against captivity in its myriad forms, hold captive intersectionality in the face of an imagined dangerous critic. So the rest of my talk makes three moves. I spend some time with the idea of the intersectionality wars, describing what I mean when I use that term and how Black feminists have become key participants in those wars. Second, I linger with the figure of the critic, who is, I argue, the centerpiece of these wars. And finally, I conclude by asking, what would happen if we, Black feminists, considered intersectionality's critics as figures who lovingly address us and generously participate in our longstanding world-making project? So first, the intersectionality wars. Again, a story. So at the 2014 American Studies Association conference, a panel entitled Kill This Keyword invited scholars to reflect on widely circulating scholarly terms and to determine if those terms should be killed, banished from our scholarly lexicon, or saved. It was an academic game show riddled with anxiety. Up for grabs were ubiquitous terms like affect, neoliberalism, and precarity. Nothing generated more anxiety than intersectionality, which was immediately declared dead. Moments after a collective performance of intersectional fatigue, a scholar voiced discomfort with killing intersectionality, because to do that would be to kill Black feminism, or perhaps to kill Black women. The room grew quiet at the prospect of symbolically killed Black women. As intersectionality slipped into Black feminism, slipped into Black women, the analytic moved from dangerous to desirable, from peril to promise, and the audience that had been quick to kill had been convinced to rescue. So I developed the term intersectionality wars to describe the kind of discursive, political, and theoretical battles staged in this scene. Indeed, as this ASA encounter makes visible, debates about intersectionality quickly become referendums on whether scholars are for or against intersectionality, rather than attempts to refine, nuance, complicate, or even think through intersectionality's contours and migrations. And debate about whether one is for or against intersectionality almost always seem to become referendums on whether one is for or against Black feminism, and perhaps for or against Black women. These slippages animate the intersectionality wars. They ensure that debating intersectionality's critical limits is always already to debate one's racial politics and allegiances. Undergirding the ASA scene and the intersectionality wars more broadly is the affective dimension of the prevailing narrative I described earlier. One where intersectionality is under siege and must be saved, one where a group of misguided critics who are characterized in various ways, ranging from careerist to anti-Black or anti-Black feminist, have made it a mission to undermine Black feminists' intellectual contributions. The intersectionality wars that I trace in my book are relatively recent battles rooted in the analytics movement across disciplinary borders, across administrative and intellectual boundaries, across academic popular boundaries. In other words, they're bound up both in the rise of Kimberly Crenshaw's mapping the margins and demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex and so on, articles to canonical status, and to intersectionality's appearance as a metric assessing feminist scholarship. So I was recently asked to review an article and on a scale of 1 to 5 to note how intersectional the piece was, which I found puzzling. The intersectionality wars are bound up in the movement of intersectionality to the center of women's studies' vision of its intellectual, administrative, and political work, and to the rise of intersectionality in the university's institutional spaces beyond women's studies. We can think of the birth of intersectionality studies think tanks and centers, or intersectional hiring initiatives. And of course, the intersectionality wars are bound up with the rise of intersectionality to the center stage in feminism's current political life. As more scholars have laid claim to intersectionality, as more disciplines have come to value, at least rhetorically, intersectionality, the intersectionality wars have escalated, with Black feminists increasingly stepping into the fray to defend the analytic from use and abuse. So if the intersectionality wars are these contentious battles, what precisely is being fought over? What are the battles that are unfolding under the sign of intersectionality? So I argue that these wars are waged around at least 3 critical sites, and I'll say a little bit about the first 2 and most about the third. So one is origin stories, the second is appropriation, and the third is the figure of the critic. So first, to say something about origin stories. The intersectionality wars are often waged over competing origin stories that attempt to narrate the genesis of intersectionality. And I'll try to linger as much as I can in religious language in this section, because I do think there is this kind of like, we need to find the genesis, like God spoke and Crenshaw wrote, and thus we need to study the text. So I want us to like linger in that kind of rhetoric. So when I describe origin stories, I capture how Black feminism often tethers intersectionality to a coherent, singular, and legible moment of intersectionality's creation. Origin stories work by presuming that intersectionality emerged not through debate or collaboration, but through a singular voice, historical moment, or foundational text. In this way, these stories are distinct from intellectual genealogies that center how concepts emerge from multiple traditions, or that analyze how different theoretical traditions treat the same concept differently. So intersectionality's origin stories aspire to perform important political work. They respond at least, or I should say, they aspire to respond to what Sirmal Bilge has called the whitening of intersectionality by insisting on the analytic's true origin in Black feminist studies. One of the central ways that this whitening unfolds, according to Bilge, is through the now commonplace claim that intersectionality was in the air, that it was nascent in women's studies long before it was named. The Black feminist response to this whitening is to assert, as Jean Belkier does, that intersectionality is, quote, one of the greatest gifts, italics, of Black women's studies to social theory as a whole. And so we can think of how this idea of Black women's studies giving a gift to social theory is a kind of critical response to Leslie McCall's often cited intersectionality as the greatest contribution of women's studies to the humanities and related fields. So in Balkir's account, intersectionality is not only the intellectual property of Black feminist theory, but evidence of Black feminism's intellectual and political generosity, a gift bestowed upon women's studies. For my purposes, what warrants investigation is Black feminism's proprietary response to women's studies' proprietary claim to intersectionality. The subject of Black feminist debate then becomes who truly owns intersectionality, who made it, an unusual response in a Black feminist discourse that has critiqued ownership and property at every political step. Even as there is an impulse toward finding intersectionality's true origins and treating this founding text as gospel, Black feminists regularly debate origin stories and amplify them in disciplinary specific ways. So we can think of how Black feminist social scientists, for example, will regularly have Patricia Hill Collins' work on the matrix of domination as the origin point of Black feminist theorizing on the mutual constitution of race, gender, class, and sexuality, while those of us who work in the humanities often perform these origin stories through Crenshaw. Other scholars emphasize that it was actually Black feminist activists who birthed intersectionality. So Patricia Hill Collins, for example, seeks to upend what she calls a stock intersectional origin story that centers Crenshaw, because in those accounts, as Collins notes, and I love this, Crenshaw was Columbus. She came back from the native lands, from far, far away with the gift of intersectionality. Wow, she brought us a present. Okay, so which I just love. For Collins, prevailing narratives of intersectionality's origins in Crenshaw or even in the academy obscure the analytic's true birthplace in social movements. And still others, increasingly common, perform their origin stories through engagements with the historical underpinnings of intersectionality. And I feel like we're very much in this mold now. So emphasizing earlier intersectional innovators, whether it's Deborah King or Frances Beale, Anna Julia Cooper, and we can especially think of the work Vivian May has done to really center Anna Julia Cooper. Brittany Cooper has also done some of that work. In the wake of the Combahee River Collective anniversary, Combahee has been held more and more as a kind of critical foremother of intersectionality, with many scholars asserting that Combahee birthed intersectional analysis in its claim that it was performing an integrated analysis based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. So oftentimes these appeals to a pre-Crenshaw or pre-Collins Black feminist scholarship seek to emphasize that Black feminists have done intersectional thinking for decades, even if that thinking didn't unfold under the banner of intersectionality. Intersectionality, in other words, was always already there. Yet this historical narrative, one that emphasizes intersectionality's long presence in Black feminist thought, has another effect, which is to suggest that all Black feminist intellectual and political work has only ever been intersectional, rather than treating intersectionality as one of Black feminism's many theoretical, creative, intellectual, and political tools. So ultimately, if origin stories offer a singular narrative which performs its own elisions, they also participate in, rather than critically disrupt, the intersectionality wars. In their insistence on correcting feminist narratives, by insisting on intersectionality's roots in the bodies of particular and singular Black women, they continue the battle over ownership, rather than critically interrogating how and why women's studies has laid claim to intersectionality, and examining when, how, and why intersectionality has come to mean good work. So the second word that I wanted to talk about was appropriation. In 2015, at a keynote address at the Social Theory Forum, Patricia Hill Collins asked, "Is intersectionality getting gentrified?" The audience laughed, and she went on, "It looks like the same neighborhood, but is it really the same neighborhood?" To pose this question at University of Massachusetts, Boston, in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in an increasingly expensive city where the language of gentrifiers and original inhabitants has become prevalent would, of course, resonate. But this language has become quite common beyond Collins's deployment of it at the Social Theory Forum. Black feminist scholars regularly mobilize language like gentrification, commodification, and colonization to describe the variety of ways that intersectionality has moved. Indeed, the intersectionality wars are often waged through attempts to highlight and police these troubling appropriations. They insist on reading the analytics movement across disciplinary borders and its movement to the center of women's studies as centrally about theft. If intersectionality has been taken, or perhaps in the language of these scholars stolen, then the task of Black feminism is to expose the theft and to reclaim ownership of the analytic. Indeed, the language of theft requires Black feminist intervention as ethical practice. To claim intersectionality and to insist on its proper usage is a rightful act of taking back what was wrongfully stolen. Thus, this language authorizes and even valorizes Black feminist territorial relationships with the analytic. While appropriation is one rhetorical device through which defensiveness is ethically mobilized, colonization is another. The language of colonization positions intersectionality as a territory that has been violently seized by outsiders. So Sirma Bilge writes, intersectionality, originally focused on transformative and counter-hegemonic knowledge production and radical politics of social justice, has been commodified and colonized for neoliberal regimes. In this act of colonization, intersectionality paradoxically works to enable scholars who are not actually performing intersectional work to make intersectional claims, or to disguise their work in the guise of intersectionality, all the while maintaining the status quo. Colonization allows scholars to lay claim to intersectionality and the idea of virtuous feminist labor that attaches to intersectionality without actually performing the demanding labor of intersectional work. The language of colonization, of course, also points to the deeply necessary decolonial labor of Black feminist theory. To return intersectionality to Black feminists and to Black women is to effectively undo long-standing practices of feminist colonialism. It is then a practice of justice. Of course, for me, the language of appropriation leaves at least two questions unanswered. First, it is unclear to me, and has remained unclear for almost a decade, how appropriation is different than the travel or migration of theories. Intellectual ideas circulate, and indeed we might even want to talk in the Q&A about how there have been certain Black feminist desires for intersectionality to circulate and move. Of course, their circulation is made possible by structures which confer value on certain concepts and devalue others, and by the institutional and geographical contexts in which ideas emerge. But this work has yet to distinguish appropriation from the variety of uses that any theory will be put to by scholars of differing theoretical and political traditions. Second, where this work succeeds is in its rigorous display that the capacity to call one's work intersectional is a claim to value. Hence the way that scholars who perform a variety of forms of work have attempted to make use of the term intersectional to describe what they do. Yet this body of work, Black feminist work, has yet to clearly reveal and then dismantle the system of value that aligns intersectional with good feminist work, that presumes that intersectional work is politically virtuous. And we, I think, in the world, see how intersectionality can be put to ends that we rhetorically put to ends that might make some of us uncomfortable, right? We can think of how intersectionality has been taken up by university administration, right, to signal certain kinds of alleged desires for diversity and inclusion. We can think about the ways in which intersectionality and diversity have been rendered synonymous in certain institutions. So instead, Black feminism has reinvested in ideas of intersectionality's value by attempting to limit who can rightfully access the analytic. So if so far I've mapped the terrain of the intersectionality wars, I want to now argue that while these wars are often waged over origin stories and accounts of appropriation, they are undergirded by that kind of narrative that I started my talk with, a story of villains, critics, and heroes and saviors, Black feminists. The intensity of the intersectionality wars is made possible because of the affective pitch of this story. And at stake in these wars is Black feminist labor to speak for Black feminist theory. So I want to spend some time with the villain in these stories, the colonizer, the appropriator, the figure imagined to be on the other side of intersectionality, the critic. And I want to ask what we Black feminists can garner from sitting with or sitting beside this disavowed figure. So I'm drawn to the language of the intersectionality wars in part because I've had a longstanding interest in the sex wars and pornography. And so I'm sort of drawn to the kind of rhetoric of wars, right? And so I'm interested in the parallel between the intersectionality wars and feminism's other infamous war, the sex wars. So though I borrow from the language of the sex wars where so-called pro-sex and so-called anti-sex feminists debated the meaning of sex, sexuality, and pleasure, what fascinates me about the intersectionality wars is how Black feminists define the various factions that allegedly debate intersectionality. So on the one hand, there are Black feminists who might be described as pro-intersectionality because of their explicit investment in safeguarding the analytic. These feminists, and I can say more about this in Q&A, I'm pretty capacious in who I describe as Black feminists. I don't see that as an identity category. I see it as a political category. So these feminists, including Vivian May, Patricia Hill Collins, Nicole Alexander Floyd, Audrey Marie Hancock, Barbara Tomlinson, Sumi Cho, Brittany Cooper, Devin Carbato. It's a pretty varied group with varied intellectual interests, but I'm going to describe them roughly as pro-intersectionality, have in distinct ways captured how intersectionality has been misused, abused, and distorted, hindering its analytic power. Indeed, in the last few years, many of these scholars have published monographs on intersectionality. Probably in the last 2 years, 4 of them have published monographs in intersectionality that participate in what I have elsewhere called the corrective turn, documenting incorrect uses of intersectionality and arguing for better, more faithful uses of the analytic and for better, more faithful engagement with the analytic's founding texts. If those are the sort of pro-intersectionality scholars, on the other side, Black feminists argue, are the critics, our anti-intersectionality scholars, whose work circulates or even proliferates as a way of undermining and undoing intersectionality. The critics' dangerous labor is described again and again in Black feminist scholarship. The critic is described as treating intersectionality cavalierly, as Vivian May's term, and imagined to produce scholarship that Barbara Tomlinson describes as damaging to feminist anti-subordination scholarship and activism. If the critic is engaged in a violent act, she's also involved in a trendy practice, since critique has become, as May notes, all the rage. She writes, intersectionality critiques have become something of their own genre. A form so flourishing, at times, it seems critique has become a primary means of taking up the concept and its literatures. So according to this logic, intersectionality's critics, but not those producing books about its origins, are careerist. Right? Rather than posing important questions about intersectionality's aspirations and critical limits, the critics' queries about intersectionality are motivated by an unrelenting willingness to yield to the demands of the corporate university, particularly the demand to produce something new. But my question is, who exactly is this figure about whom so much has been written? Well, Black feminists have carefully pointed out the ubiquity of critiques, offering a picture of an intersectionality under siege. There's been considerably less care in naming the critics who supposedly proffer and circulate these now overwhelming critiques. Instead, the critic's presence and even omnipresence is assumed. In fact, I think there's a way in which, as readers, we are sort of imagined as always knowing who the critic is, right? The critic doesn't even have to be named because we all just know who it is. So Barbara Tomlinson names the critic in a sort of lengthier quote that I'm going to read, describing the myriad forms of violent work this critical subject performs. She writes, critics may argue, for example, that intersectionality should be set free from the identities of marginalized women of color who originated it. Critics may claim that intersectionality has not yet revealed as much as it ought to about identities. Critics may even argue as if intersectionality's critique of structural power interferes with its more important use for developing theories of identity. I linger in 2 moments of Tomlinson's description of the critics' varied and dangerous labor. First, the ubiquity of the term critics, and we can even say the ubiquity of the term critics alongside the unwillingness to actually name that person, right? Critics are presumed to be monolithic in their labor. They all perform the same intellectual and political work. And all critics seem to perform all of the labor that Tomlinson references, effectively undermining intersectionality's anti-subordination efforts and ensuring the analytic's vulnerability. And second, the critic is so ubiquitous that she doesn't need to be named. It is assumed that the reader knows who she is, precisely because her work has affected every aspect of intersectionality circulations, because critique has already circulated. There is, though, one critic who is named again and again, Jasbir Puar. Puar is often figured in both scholarly and popular work as the paradigmatic critic of intersectionality. Anna Karistasis treats Puar's work as, quote, the most influential critique of intersectionality. Tiffany Lethobo-King describes Puar's work as, quote, one of the most well-circulated critiques in the humanities, and argues that Puar's work is, quote, immensely effective at encouraging people to consider transcending and moving past intersectionality. And Patrick Granka calls Puar, quote, one of intersectionality's most committed critics. The very same New Yorker article that I described at the beginning of my talk as describing intersectionality as the heart of campus activism describes Jaspir Puar as intersectionality's, quote, key critic. So Puar's work then is regularly cited not only as a criticism of intersectionality, but as the criticism of intersectionality. Puar is the critic. I want to pause here and ask what it is about the racial and institutional politics of Black feminism that has permitted or even facilitated Puar's work on assemblage to be positioned both as critique and as the critique. Moreover, I want to emphasize that despite the fact that intersectionality is regularly described by Black feminists as under siege, only one scholar is regularly cited as performing this critical work. My interest in lingering in Black feminist scholars' preoccupation with Puar as the critic is not at all an investment in rescuing Puar from the title of critic. Indeed, rescue is one of the genre conventions of the intersectionality wars that I want to upend. I'm actually interested in interrogating what it means that her work has come to stand within Black feminism for an overwhelming set of practices that undermine intersectionality, and to interrogate how one critical body has been recast as an overwhelming chorus of critics. Puar's status as the critic is particularly surprising because much of her engagement with intersectionality has not centered on assemblage as alternative to intersectionality, but on intersectionality's institutional lives and iterations. Indeed, Puar carefully traces how intersectionality has come to be deployed in the space of women's studies, noting, quote, the method of intersectionality is most predominantly used to qualify the specific difference of women of color, a category that has now become, I would argue, simultaneously emptied of specific meaning on the one hand and overdetermined in its deployment on the other. In this usage, intersectionality always produces an other, she writes, and that other is always a woman of color who must invariably be shown to be resistant, subversive, or articulating a grievance. Here, Puar asks us to consider how intersectionality has become both deeply specific and despecified simultaneously. She then considers how intersectionality is always collapsed onto an imagined woman of color body, I would argue Black female body, whose fleshiness is assumed to be synonymous with injury. Moreover, Puar highlights how questioning intersectionality results in precisely what has happened to Puar, the placement of the theorist and her frameworks as traitorous. My focus on this portion of Puar's work is not meant to ignore her critical questions about intersectionality, her sometimes presentation of the analytic as fixed and static, as opposed to assemblage's movement and dynamism, her presentation of intersectionality as identitarian, as opposed to assemblage's investment in affect. Indeed, there is a significant strand of Puar's work that has offered assemblage as an analytic that thinks difference, affect, information, sensation, and feeling in ways that she seems to think intersectionality cannot. Instead, I want to underscore how her interrogations of intersectionality's racial politics in US women's studies get erased when her work is positioned merely as criticism or even condemnation of intersectionality. So let me push on this some more and in perhaps a more speculative way. It is worth noting that intersectionality's only regularly named critic and the analytic's imagined preeminent critic is constantly represented as an outsider to Black feminism. Indeed, while my venture here can only be speculative, I want to linger in a consideration of the fact that Puar's status as critic, as the critic, is secured and sutured through both her body and her imagined identity. My consideration of Puar's status as an outsider to Black feminism and as an outsider to the category Black woman unfolds alongside the ways my own work can get described as critique. While some of my earlier work, particularly Rethinking Intersectionality, is occasionally described as a critique of intersectionality, it's largely understood as emerging in and through an affection for Black feminism and for Black women's intellectual production, a fact that might be tethered to my own scholarly work's rootedness in Black feminist theory, but that might also be tethered to the ongoing collapses between racially marked subjects' bodies and their objects of study. When, for example, Brittany Cooper describes my work, she situates it as a Black feminist critique of intersectionality, one that emerges from inside the imagined location where intersectionality was born. So my location as Black feminist and as Black woman, and again, those two collapsed, means that my critiques of intersectionality are imagined as practices of love and affection rather than hostility, and are thus treated with a kind of generosity rather than suspicion. In other words, puar is cast as an outsider, a dangerous interloper, whose critiques of intersectionality are rooted in an unfamiliarity with Black feminism, or perhaps some argue an animus towards Black feminism. The notion of puar as outsider to Black feminism has been echoed by larger, I think deeply problematic critiques of puar's work as anti-Black. One critique of terrorist assemblages notes that the book has, quote, an anxious intent to sidestep Blackness, positioning puar as outside of Black feminism, outside of Black studies, and perhaps as hostile to both. If puar is positioned as a non-Black feminist whose critiques are the work of an outsider, she's also often positioned as an outsider to the feminist project itself, with her roots in queer theory underscored. So Lynn Huffer, for example, in describing puar, notes that puar, quote, shifts her focus away from intersectionality to queer assemblage. In doing so, she directly challenges the unquestioned stability of the subject implicit in feminist intersectionality theory. So intersectionality theory becomes feminist, assemblage becomes queer, right? Huffer is not alone in describing puar's work as queer theory, and puar herself as a queer theorist. My interest here, again, is not at all in reifying a distinction between feminist theory and queer theory. We've done that. Or in reanimating notions of the divisiveness between the two. Rather, I'm interested in considering how puar's imagined location within queer theory, which is regularly imagined to be outside of and perhaps against feminist theory, amplifies the conception of her critique of intersectionality as formed by an outsider, and thus makes intersectionality appear particularly and problematically vulnerable. I will mention here, though I won't have time to fully go into it now, but we can talk about it in Q&A, how puar's figuring as a queer of color critic scholar, right, as part of a queer of color critique, might also amplify her position as outsider to Black feminism, as queer of color critique has both relied on Black feminist knowledge production to describe its intellectual commitments and rooted its commitment to Black feminism in a particular 1970s historical moment, often centering Audre Lorde as a kind of critical foremother. So what can we conclude from the fact that despite the rhetoric that the critic, like the appropriator, is everywhere, and that critique is overwhelming, she turns out to be almost exclusively just pure puar. In my larger project, I underscore that the figure of the omnipresent critic is an imaginative projection of Black feminist defensiveness, a figure that imaginatively animates the defensive affect, even as that figure is a concept, an idea, a fantasy, rather than an actual presence whose work animates the archive. In revealing that the critic is rarely named, and when she is so often puar, I seek to suggest that Black feminists produce rather than expose the omnipresent critic. Thus, the ubiquitous critic who dismantles intersectionality is actually one scholar who is relentlessly cast as an outsider to Black feminism, a framing of her scholarship that requires a refusal to engage her work on intersectionality's institutional locations and insist on her location in theoretical traditions that are envisioned as apart from contemporary Black feminist scholarship. In other words, treating puar as intersectionality's critic requires shoring up the boundaries of Black feminism to mark her as an outsider. The lure of this vision of the ubiquitous critic is that it presents an intersectionality relentlessly under siege and attacked by outsiders. This reading empowers a Black feminist project that guards intersectionality as precious territory, made, animated, and owned by Black feminists. This reading makes not only possible, but necessary, a defensive posture. So as I indicated in the beginning moments of this talk, I enter this debate not merely as a scholar invested in Black feminist theory, but also as a scholar whose name has, at times, and usually gently, been attached to the category of the critic. So this talk then has for me prompted a desire not to upend the category of the critic, but to willingly inhabit it as a way of imagining a Black feminism that can be otherwise. It has prompted me to ask, what is it that the critic might offer us? And how might Black feminists cultivate the critic, effectively seeing what she offers not as a threatening gesture, but as a kind of love letter, one that in Lauren Berlant's words offers us a chance to imagine becoming different. I want to suggest that part of the critic's offering is a rigorous engagement with the psychic structure of our tradition, one made most apparent in this prevailing story about a dangerous outsider determined to undermine us, and our current preoccupation with narrativizing our field around a sense of our besiegement, rather than, for example, thinking about our own wills to institutionality, our own attachments to the university, and our ongoing desires for institutional life. The critic offers us a chance to refuse the lure of territoriality, a form of imagined agency that always leads us to an impasse rather than liberating us from the destructive intersectionality wars. And I think the critic's presence requires that we begin to imagine new forms of Black feminist agency, or perhaps even embrace, rather than relentlessly reject, the vulnerability that intersectionality's movements can make some of us feel. Part of this offering is also compelling a critical attention to how we, Black feminists, construct who is inside and outside the boundaries of our creative, political, and intellectual tradition, pushing us to interrogate how we became involved in a boundary policing exercise. Indeed, a radical embrace of the critic requires us to contend with questions like, what are ways of valuing intersectionality beyond making it into territory that we fiercely guard? What are strategies of practicing care that refuse the logics of property? What might forms of loving tenderness toward Black feminist intellectual production beyond claims of ownership resemble? Can we express our deepest and most cherished investments otherwise? Ultimately, what the critic sends us is not a world-ending message, but a generous plea to move beyond the deeply alluring project of holding on to intersectionality. An invitation to radically let go of the analytic and to allow it to move, travel, and migrate in ways that might ultimately unsettle us. This is then a chance to radically embrace the possibility of other ways to be and feel Black feminist. Thank you.